For 12 years, Frank Sullivan had been the night janitor at Millbrook Regional Airport with a perfect record. Never late, never a complaint, never a problem. He was ordinary, reliable, forgettable, until his faded Air Force pilot wings tattoo became visible. That tattoo changed everything. Welcome to the Untold Stories. Before we dive into this incredible tale of hidden aviation heroism and silent service, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter. Millbrook Regional Airport wasn't much to look at. A small municipal facility that served commuter flights and private aircraft. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and nothing much changed from year to year. The terminal building was modest, the runways adequate, and the staff small enough that each person's routine mattered to the smooth operation of the whole facility. Frank Sullivan had been part of that routine for 12 years. Every night at exactly 11 p.m., he would arrive in his battered pickup truck, park in the employee lot, and begin his shift as the overnight custodial supervisor. By morning, the terminal would be spotless, the floors polished, the windows gleaming, and every trash can emptied. Frank worked alone, preferred it that way, and never missed a shift in over 4,000 nights. At 68, Frank was unremarkable in every visible way. Average height, gray hair kept short, weathered hands that spoke of a lifetime of manual labor. He wore the same style of work clothes every night. Dark blue coveralls with Millbrook Regional Maintenance embroidered on the chest pocket, steel-toed boots that never seemed to wear out, and a baseball cap that had seen better decades. He was polite when spoken to, professional in his duties, and invisible in the way that dedicated service workers often become. The airport staff, who worked day shifts, rarely saw Frank, but they noticed his work. The terminal always looked perfect when they arrived each morning. The pilots who flew the early commuter routes knew him only as a quiet figure. They might glimpse mopping floors or emptying waste bins as they passed through the terminal before dawn. The few overnight staff, a security guard and an air traffic controller, would nod to Frank as their shifts overlapped, but none of them had ever had what could be called a real conversation with him. What none of them knew was that Frank's routine started hours before he officially clocked in. Every evening at 9 p.m., he would drive to the airport and park outside the perimeter fence. For 30 minutes, he would sit in his truck and watch the airfield, not in any suspicious way, but with the steady observation of someone who understood aircraft operations at a level that went far beyond casual interest. He watched takeoffs and landings with the critical eye of someone who could read the subtle signs of pilot skill, mechanical condition, and weather impact that most people would never notice. Frank's work routine was a masterpiece of efficiency that had taken him years to perfect. He moved through the terminal with systematic precision, following patterns that ensured every area was cleaned thoroughly, while minimizing the time spent in any location where he might encounter people. His supply cart was organized with military attention to detail, every tool and cleaning product positioned for optimal accessibility. His timing was precise enough that he could predict exactly when each task would be completed. The overnight security guard, a young man named Mike Rodriguez, had tried numerous times over the years to engage Frank in conversation. Mike worked the graveyard shift and appreciated having someone else around during the long, quiet hours. But Frank's responses were always polite and brief. Evening, Mike. Yes, sir. Have a good night. Nothing more than necessary for basic human courtesy. Mike had noticed things about Frank that others missed. The way he moved with purpose and economy of motion, the way his eyes constantly scanned his surroundings, not out of nervousness but with the automatic awareness of someone trained to notice details. The way he could lift and move heavy equipment with techniques that suggested formal training in proper body mechanics. Most intriguingly, the way Frank would sometimes pause when aircraft were departing or arriving, listening to engine sounds with the focused attention of someone who understood what those sounds meant. Captain Lisa Martinez had been flying for 8 years, the last 3 as a pilot for Regional Express, the commuter airline that used Millbrook as a hub for connecting flights to larger airports. At 31, she was one of the youngest captains in the company's fleet, a position she'd earned through skill, dedication, and an ability to handle difficult flying conditions. With calm professionalism, Lisa had always been fascinated by aviation, history, and the stories of the pilots who'd come before her. She'd grown up hearing tales from her grandfather, who'd flown transport planes during World War II, and her father, who'd been a military pilot during the Cold War. She understood that flying was more than just a job, it was a calling that connected generations of aviators through shared experiences of risk, responsibility, and the pure joy of controlled flight. Working the late shifts that concluded each day's flight schedule, Lisa often found herself in the terminal during Frank's cleaning routine. She noticed him. Of course, it was impossible not to notice someone who worked with such methodical precision. But like everyone else, she'd never thought much about who he was beyond his function as the night janitor. That changed on a Tuesday night in November when a mechanical delay kept Lisa at the airport. Well past her usual departure time, she was completing paperwork in the pilot's lounge when she noticed Frank working in the adjacent crew briefing room. The room had large windows that provided a clear view of the airfield, and as Frank cleaned, he kept glancing outside with an attention that seemed unusually focused. A Cessna Citation was practicing night approaches, flying the same pattern repeatedly. As an instructor worked with a student pilot, Lisa watched Frank's face as he observed the aircraft, and what she saw surprised her. This wasn't the casual interest of someone watching planes for entertainment. Frank was reading the aircraft's performance with the analytical focus of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at. When the student pilot made a particularly sloppy approach, coming in fast with inconsistent altitude control, Lisa saw Frank wince slightly and shake his head. It was a subtle reaction, but it was the response of someone who recognized poor technique when he saw it. Long night, Lisa asked, stepping into the briefing room. Frank looked up from the table he was wiping down, clearly surprised to be addressed. Yes, Mom, equipment delays, I heard. Yeah, hydraulic warning light. Better to fix it on the ground than wonder about it in the air. Lisa gestured toward the window where the citation was making another approach. That student's having trouble with the speed control. Frank paused in his cleaning, glanced toward the aircraft, then back at Lisa. Seems to be coming in a little hot, he said carefully. Lisa was struck by the precision of his observation. Hot was pilot terminology for excessive approach speed. It wasn't the kind of language she'd expect to hear from someone outside aviation. You know much about flying? Frank's hesitation was so brief that most people would have missed it. Just what you pick up working around airports. But Lisa had caught the hesitation, and more importantly, she'd seen the way Frank had tracked the aircraft's approach path with his eyes. That kind of focused observation didn't come from casual interest, it came from training. How long have you been working here? She asked. 12 years, Frank replied, returning to his cleaning with perhaps a little more intensity than necessary. Were you in aviation before that? Another pause. Some. Lisa's curiosity was fully engaged now. Frank's responses weren't evasive exactly, but they had the careful quality of someone who was used to not talking about his past. She'd encountered that kind of communication style before, usually from military personnel who'd worked in classified or sensitive positions. Before she could ask another question, Frank's radio crackled with a message from airport operations. About a delayed arrival, he acknowledged the call with professional brevity, then excused himself to prepare for the additional aircraft servicing that would be required. Lisa watched him go, more intrigued than ever. Something about Frank Sullivan didn't add up. His knowledge of aircraft operations, his precise use of aviation terminology, his careful responses to questions about his background, it all suggested someone with more aviation experience than a typical airport maintenance worker would have. Over the following weeks, Lisa found herself paying more attention to Frank's work routine. She noticed that he timed his cleaning activities to avoid interfering with aircraft operations, showing an understanding of airport logistics that went beyond basic courtesy. She observed that he could identify aircraft types by their engine sounds from considerable distances. Most tellingly, she saw him react to radio communications about weather conditions and air traffic with the informed interest of someone who understood the operational implications. Lisa's curiosity led her to do some quiet investigation. She learned that Frank had been hired 12 years earlier with excellent references, but minimal background information. His employment file listed previous experience as general maintenance and transportation, which was vague enough to mean almost anything. More interesting was the fact that his emergency contact information listed him as retired military. Though no branch or service details were specified, the breakthrough came on a cold December night, when a winter storm system was affecting flight operations. Lisa had been delayed by weather and found herself in the terminal during the early morning hours. When Frank was finishing his shift, ice was forming on aircraft surfaces, and the maintenance crew was working to de-ice several planes before the morning departure. Schedule began. Frank was cleaning near the large windows that overlooked the tarmac when one of the maintenance supervisors approached him. Frank, you ever seen de-icing operations before? We could use an extra pair of experienced eyes out there. I've seen it done, Frank replied. But his attention was focused on the aircraft being serviced. You want to be careful with that citation, he added, pointing to a particular aircraft. Ice forms differently on those wing profiles. Easy to miss spots near the control surfaces. The maintenance supervisor looked surprised. How do you know about wing ice formation? Frank realized he'd said more than he intended. Just pick things up over the years. But Lisa was close enough to hear the exchange, and Frank's knowledge of aircraft icing characteristics was far too specific to have been picked up casually. Ice formation on control surfaces was the kind of detailed technical knowledge that required formal training in aviation operations. As Frank moved on to continue his cleaning routine, Lisa made a decision that would change both their lives. She followed him to the supply room where he was restocking his cart. Frank, she said quietly, can I ask you something? He looked up, clearly preferring not to be cornered in conversation, but too polite to walk away. Yes, ma'am? Your knowledge of aviation operations, it's pretty extensive for someone who just works around airports. Frank's expression became guarded. I pay attention to things. The ice formation comment, the approach speed observation, the way you listen to radio traffic. That's not casual observation. That's training. Frank was quiet for a long moment, weighing how much truth he wanted to share. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. Long time ago, I flew some. What kind of flying? Another pause. Military. What branch? Air Force. Lisa felt the thrill of recognition. Her instincts had been correct. What did you fly? Frank looked directly at her for the first time in their conversation. F-16s mostly. Some other aircraft. The casual way he mentioned flying one of the most sophisticated fighter aircraft in the world left Lisa momentarily speechless. F-16. Pilots weren't just military personnel. They were among the most highly trained and skilled aviators in the world. For how long? 28 years. Retired in 2003. Lisa's mind raced through the implications. Someone who'd flown F-16s for nearly 3 decades would have been involved in some of the most significant military operations of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Did you see combat? Frank's expression became distant. Some. Where? Gulf? War. Bosnia. Kosovo. Few other places. Lisa realized she was talking to someone whose flying experience dwarfed her own. What rank did you retire at? Lieutenant Colonel. The title hung in the air between them. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Sullivan, retired Air Force pilot, currently working as a night janitor at a small regional airport. The disconnect was staggering. Why? Didn't you stay in aviation after retiring? Frank resumed organizing his supplies. But his movements had less focus than usual. Tried for a while. Commercial flying wasn't the same corporate flying was to political. Civilian instruction was. He paused, searching for words. I'd taught enough young pilots how to stay alive in combat. Didn't want to teach rich kids how to play with expensive toys. So, you became a janitor. Needed work. This place needed someone reliable. Seemed like a good fit. Lisa could hear the resignation in his voice, but also something else, a kind of peace with his decision. Do you miss it? Flying? Frank stopped what he was doing and looked out the window at the airfield. Every day. The simple honesty of his answer was more powerful than any elaborate explanation could have been. Lisa found herself looking at Frank with entirely new eyes. This wasn't just a custodial worker who happened to know something about aviation. This was a career military pilot who'd chosen to stay connected to the aviation world in the only way that felt authentic to him. Can I ask you something else? Lisa said. Frank nodded. Why keep it secret? I mean, people here would be fascinated to know your background. Frank smiled sadly. What would I tell them? That I spent 30 years learning to kill people from the air. That I can still calculate missile engagement envelopes and threat assessment patterns. That I wake up some nights hearing radar warning signals that aren't there. He paused, then continued more quietly. These folks see someone who keeps their workplace clean and safe. That's enough. They don't need to know about the other stuff. Lisa understood. But something about his isolation bothered her. But you're still using those skills. The way you observe operations here, the way you understand air traffic patterns, the way you spot maintenance issues, you're still contributing your expertise. Maybe, Frank said. Or maybe I'm just an old pilot who can't let go of what he used to be. Lisa spent the rest of the week thinking about her conversation with Frank. She found herself researching the conflicts he'd mentioned, trying to understand what his service would have entailed. What she learned was sobering. F-16 pilots who'd flown combat missions in the Gulf War, Bosnia, and Kosovo had been involved in some of the most dangerous and politically sensitive operations of modern warfare. They'd flown close air support missions, interdiction strikes, and air superiority operations in environments where split-second decisions could determine the outcome of battles. She also learned that many military pilots struggled with the transition to civilian life. The intensity and purpose of military aviation was difficult to replicate in civilian careers. Some pilots found meaning in commercial aviation or flight instruction, but others never quite found their place in a world where flying was just a job, rather than a calling. The more Lisa thought about Frank's situation, the more she appreciated the quiet dignity of his choice, rather than struggling to find civilian aviation work. That would never match the significance of his military service. He found a way to stay connected to the aviation community, while making a meaningful contribution in a completely different role. She also began to notice things about Frank's work that she'd previously taken for granted. The terminal was always perfectly maintained, but more than that, it was maintained with an understanding of how a clean, well-organized environment contributed to safe and efficient operations. Frank's timing ensured that his work never interfered with critical operations, like aircraft servicing or passenger movements. His attention to detail meant that potential safety hazards were identified and addressed before they could become problems. A week after her conversation with Frank, Lisa decided to share what she'd learned with the airport manager, a former Navy pilot named Jim Crawford who'd taken over operations at Millbrook 5 years earlier. She felt that someone in authority should know about the level of expertise they had working in their facility. Crawford listened to Lisa's story with growing amazement. Are you telling me that our night janitor is a retired Air Force lieutenant colonel with combat experience? That's exactly what I'm telling you. Crawford shook his head in disbelief. In 5 years of working here, I've never had a single conversation with the man about aviation. I just thought he was a really good custodian. He doesn't want recognition. He made that very clear, but I thought you should know what kind of person we have working here. Crawford was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. Do you know what kind of security clearance someone like that would have had? Lisa hadn't thought about that aspect. High level, I assume. Try top secret with special access programs. F-16 pilots who flew combat missions and sensitive operations would have been briefed on classified targeting information, tactical procedures, and strategic objectives that are still probably classified today. The magnitude of Frank's background was beginning to sink in. This wasn't just someone with aviation knowledge. This was someone who'd been trusted with some of the most sensitive military information in the country. What do you want to do with this information? Lisa asked. Crawford considered the question carefully. Respect his privacy, first and foremost, but maybe find ways to tap into his expertise without making him uncomfortable. The opportunity came 2 weeks later, when the airport was conducting its annual emergency response drill. The exercise was designed to test coordination between airport operations, local emergency services, and airline personnel in the event of an aircraft incident. As the drill was being planned, Crawford had an idea. He approached Frank during one of the rare occasions when their schedules overlapped. "Frank, I wanted to ask you about something. We're running our emergency response exercise next week, and I was wondering if you might have any insights from your previous experience that could help us improve our procedures." Frank's expression was carefully neutral. "What kind of insights?" "Well, I understand you might have some background in aviation operations. Anything you could share that might help us run a more realistic or effective drill would be appreciated." Frank was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his response. "What specifically are you looking for?" "Aircraft incident scenarios, coordination between different response teams, that sort of thing." Frank nodded slowly. "I might have some thoughts." What followed was a masterclass in emergency response planning that left Crawford and the other participants amazed at the depth and practicality of Frank's knowledge. Without revealing any classified information, Frank was able to suggest scenario modifications that made the drill more realistic and training improvements that would enhance actual emergency response capabilities. His suggestions came from years of experience with aircraft emergencies in combat and training environments, and his understanding of how different systems and personnel needed to coordinate under extreme pressure. He spoke with quiet authority about the importance of clear communication protocols, the need for flexible response plans that could adapt to changing conditions, and the critical timing factors that could determine the difference between successful rescue operations and catastrophic failures. When the drill was conducted, it ran more smoothly and effectively than any previous exercise in the airport's history. The improvements Frank had suggested resulted in better coordination, faster response times, and more realistic training for everyone involved. After the drill, Crawford pulled Frank aside. "That was incredible. Your recommendations made all the difference." Frank shrugged. "Just applied some things I'd learned over the years." "Those weren't just things you'd learned. That was expertise at a level I've rarely seen." Frank looked uncomfortable with the praise. "Just trying to help." Crawford realized that Frank's discomfort came not from modesty, but from years of being trained not to discuss his capabilities or experiences. "Frank, can I ask you something? Are you happy here? I mean, with this work?" Frank considered the question seriously. "It's honest work. It serves a purpose. It keeps me close to aviation without having to pretend that civilian flying is the same as what I used to do." "But you're obviously capable of much more." "Capable and suited for our different things," Frank replied. "I spent 30 years in a world where everything was classified, where every mission had strategic implications, where mistakes could get people killed. This work is simple and clear. I clean the terminal, it stays clean. I maintain the facilities, they stay maintained. No hidden agendas, no political complications, no life or death decisions." Crawford began to understand. Frank hadn't taken the custodial job because he couldn't find other work. He'd taken it because it allowed him to contribute to the aviation community while avoiding the complications and expectations that would come with any position. That acknowledged his background. Plus, Frank added with the first genuine smile Crawford had seen from him. "I get to watch aircraft operations every day. Not many retired pilots get to stay that close to what they love." Over the following months, word of Frank's background gradually spread through the small airport community. But rather than the dramatic revelation that might have occurred elsewhere, the disclosure was handled with the respect and discretion that small communities often show for people they've come to value. Pilots began acknowledging Frank with the professional courtesy that aviators show each other. Mechanics started asking for his input on technical issues, recognizing that his knowledge of aircraft systems came from years of depending on them in life or death situations. Air traffic controllers began including him in conversations about operational improvements, appreciating his perspective on how different procedures affected overall safety and efficiency. Frank handled the increased recognition with characteristic grace, sharing his knowledge when asked, but never volunteering information or seeking attention. He continued to perform his custodial duties with the same dedication and professionalism he'd always shown. But now there was an additional dimension to his role as someone who could contribute expertise along with labor. Lisa noticed the change in how people interacted with Frank, and she was pleased to see that the respect he received didn't come with pressure to be something he wasn't. He remained the quiet, reliable night janitor who kept the terminal spotless. But now, he was also acknowledged as someone whose knowledge and experience had value beyond his official job description. One evening in spring, Lisa found Frank on the observation deck that overlooked the main runway. He was watching a flight for military aircraft that had stopped at Millbrook for fuel. During a cross-country training mission, the aircraft were F-16s, the same type Frank had flown for most of his career. Brings back memories. Lisa asked, joining him at the railing. Frank watched as the aircraft taxied toward the runway, their engines warming up for departure. "Different world now," he said. "Technology's advanced. Procedures have changed, but the basics are still the same. Do you ever think about getting back into flying?" Frank shook his head. That was a young man's job. Reflexes aren't what they were. Eyes aren't as sharp. And the world doesn't need old warriors as much as it needs people who can do the everyday work. That keeps things running. As they watched, the F-16s took off in formation, their afterburners lighting up the evening sky as they climbed away from the airport. Frank followed their departure with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what the pilots were experiencing. Besides, he said as the sound of the aircraft faded into the distance, "I had my time in the cockpit, 28 years of it. Now, I get to be part of aviation in a different way." Lisa understood that Frank had found something that many retired military personnel struggled to achieve, a way to honor his past, while building a meaningful present. He'd taken skills learned in combat and applied them to protecting a different kind of mission, ensuring that civilian aviation operations ran smoothly and safely. His transition from fighter pilot to night janitor might seem like a dramatic step down to outside observers, but Frank had found purpose in service regardless of its form. He learned that significance didn't come from rank or recognition, but from the knowledge that his work mattered to people who depended on him. As the months passed, Frank became something of an unofficial advisor on aviation matters at Millbrook Regional. His input was sought on everything from facility improvements to operational procedures, and his quiet expertise contributed to making the airport safer and more efficient. But he never forgot that his primary job was keeping the terminal clean and well-maintained. Every night, he continued his systematic routine, ensuring that passengers and crew would find a spotless, well-organized facility when they arrived each morning. The difference was that now people understood the full measure of what Frank Sullivan brought to his work. His dedication to excellence came not just from personal pride, but from decades of military training that had taught him that attention to detail could be the difference between success and failure, between safety and disaster. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Sullivan, United States Air Force, retired Millbrook Regional Airport Custodial Supervisor, fighter pilot, silent professional, a man who'd learned that service comes in many forms, and that heroism isn't always about the uniform you wear or the recognition you receive. Sometimes it's about showing up every night at 11 p.m., putting on your work clothes, and making sure that everyone who depends on you finds exactly what they need when they need it. Sometimes it's about taking pride in work that others might overlook, understanding that every job done well contributes to something larger than itself. Frank Sullivan had spent 28 years defending his country from the cockpit of one of the world's most advanced fighter aircraft. For the past 12 years, he'd been defending his community's safety and comfort with a mop, a vacuum cleaner, and the same dedication to excellence that had made him an outstanding pilot. The mission had changed, but the commitment hadn't, and every night, as Frank made his rounds through the terminal, he carried with him the knowledge that service is service, regardless of the setting. Whether you're flying combat missions over hostile territory or cleaning floors in a small-town airport, what matters is doing the job right and taking care of the people who count on you. That tattoo on his arm, those faded Air Force pilot wings, told the story of who Frank had been. But the work he did every night told the story of who he'd chosen to become. Both stories mattered, and together they painted the picture of a man who understood that true heroism isn't about glory or recognition. It's about showing up, doing the work, and making the world a little better, one clean floor at a time.